Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Business Process Catalog and Guidance. My name is Philip Musin, and I will be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live event. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Rachel Profitt, Principal Program Manager. Rachel, over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Philip, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Today's Tech Talk is part of the series of Tech Talks, and we're focusing in today on part 3 of the Tech Talk series, using the Business Process Catalog to manage scope and estimation. Again, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Rachel Profitt, and I do invite you to connect with me if we're not already connected. The QR code that you see on your screen can be used to connect with me directly on LinkedIn. You can find my email at rachel.profitt@microsoft.com. You can check out my blog at dynamics365lady.com. Find me on Twitter or LinkedIn at Rachel Profitt, or check out my YouTube channel at Dynamics365 Unboxed. Like I said, today's session is part of a Tech Talk series, and this is the 3rd session in the series, and it's a large series that will grow and have more Tech Talks added to it. Parts 1 and Parts 2 of our series were introducing the Dynamics 365 Guidance Hub and an introduction to business processes within our Guidance Hub. Next week and the week after, we have 2 more parts that are planned, where we'll be diving into the details of how to author both business processes and business process patterns. So let's take a closer look at the agenda for today's session. Today, we're going to be focusing in first on an overview of the importance of scope and estimation process within your Dynamics 365 implementations. We're also going to talk a little bit about how you can define business goals and objectives for your project. And then we'll spend some time both on the process for defining scope and estimating your project effort and using the catalog as a catalyst to help in these processes. Then at the end, we're going to shift gears and I'll walk through the process on how you can actually download and import the Business Process Catalog into your Azure DevOps project. We'll have some time at the end for Q&A as well. Before we dive into the details of setting your goals and objectives, I wanted to quickly review some ways and times throughout your project that you can leverage our catalog to help your implementation go smoother. We're primarily going to be focusing in on the scope and estimation process today, but we will be touching on a few of these other items as well. We'll have additional sessions in the future to dive into some of these other topics in more detail. One way that you can use the catalog is to help accelerate your demo and pre-sales process by defining exactly in a discovery phase, exactly what the customer needs are, and outlining that process and using the guidance that we've published to help put your demonstrations together. You can also use the catalog as a tool that you can import into a business process modeling tool. We'll talk more about business process modeling in a future session in this Tech Talk series, but you can also use the catalog to help you determine your fit gap analysis after you've gone through your scope and estimation process. Part of what I'll be demonstrating today is how you can turn the business process catalog that you've narrowed down to your specific scope and project to create a project plan that you can import into a project management tool such as Azure DevOps. The link to download the catalog can be found here on your screen. It's aka.ms/business process catalog. If you missed part 2 in our Tech Talk series, we do invite you to check out the recording of that, which is available out on the community site and on the YouTube channel. In part 2 of the series, we dove into a lot more detail about the catalog, how to download it, navigate around, and so on. So let's switch gears and talk about the importance of project scope and estimation in your project. There are many benefits to defining your scope and estimating your project clearly at the onset of your project. A clear project scope acts as the roadmap for the entire implementation process and helps to outline the specific goals, objectives, and deliverables for your specific project, while it also mitigates the risk of scope creep and helps ensure that your project will stay on track. Aligning the estimation process with the business processes that are in scope for your project will help ensure that your project delivers a tailored solution. And understanding and mapping those business processes is a key step to an accurate estimation. This process enhances the effectiveness of your Dynamics 365 or technology solution in general to ensure that it meets your business needs. It also helps set the foundation for the language that you'll talk with your business about. So when we define the business processes and map those terminology and concepts that your business uses to the terminology and concepts that the software or technology uses, then you'll have a much better framework to start from so that we know that everybody is on the same page. The process of implementing your scope and estimation process can also have an impact on the cost and the resources that are required to execute on your particular project. Accurate scope and estimation processes lead to better resource allocation, and it can help in avoiding unnecessary costs and delays in your project. This process leads to efficient use of resources, which then results in a cost-effective implementation. When we identify potential risks at the outset of a project, we can facilitate the process of a well-defined scope as one of the outcomes. Having that accurate estimation leads to the ability to develop clear contingency plans early in the project. It can also reduce the likelihood of project disruptions, which leads to on-time projects. We'll talk about stakeholders and communication several times throughout today's presentation, but stakeholder communication and alignment is critical in any project from the onset. Clearly defined scope and estimation processes help facilitate effective communication with your stakeholders. It helps you align the expectations of those stakeholders and those business users and helps ensure that everyone is on the same page. It can also help build confidence and trust among those project participants. Now, let's switch gears and talk a little bit more specifically about how we can use the catalog to help define the business goals and objectives. We've broken down the process of aligning business goals and objectives into 5 pillars. First is the pillar of understanding the business goals. This is where we need to get a clear definition of the overarching goals that the organization has. Some examples of this might include things like improving customer satisfaction or optimizing operational efficiency, just as 2 simple examples. Next, we need to map these goals and objectives, business goals that we've defined, to the business processes. Here, we're going to demonstrate how each business goal aligns with specific processes. Examples would be that the customer satisfaction goal is mapped to order fulfillment and the supporting processes. When we think about the catalog, we recommend that you consider adding a column that shows what those business goals are mapped to the actual business processes that are going to be in scope for your project. Next, we need to ensure that we have process alignment. Here, I want to emphasize the need for direct alignment between the business goals that you've put forth and the actual business processes that are in scope. So an example here is where I would map the operational efficiency goal to the streamlined inventory management. And so streamlined inventory management is part of the inventory to deliver end-to-end processes. So I would need to select the business processes within inventory to deliver that map to that specific goal. It's important next to make sure that you have measurable objectives. So we recommend that you define those measurable objectives for each goal. So taking our customer satisfaction goal, let's say our objective is to reduce order processing time by 20% or increase customer retention by 15%. It's important that when you're defining these objectives, you have a clear way to measure them, both before the project starts and after the project starts, so you can measure the success of your project and determine if more refactoring might be needed. It's also important to make sure that the goals and objectives that you set out are achievable. The alignment of the goals and objectives that you set out helps ensure that every business process that is in scope for your technology project contributes directly to the achievement of those business goals. So for example, efficient order processing directly contributes to improved customer satisfaction, which directly relates to one or more business processes that are in scope for your project. We've summarized this process into 3 basic steps that you can follow when integrating your business goals into the scope definition. The first step after you've worked with the business stakeholders is to recap the identified business goals and objectives. In the most simplistic form, you can use a simple Word document or PowerPoint to outline and document those goals and objectives. But in the catalog, to make sure that we get the mapping, we recommend that you add a pick list or a drop-down list of those goals and objectives that you've defined. They might be summarized for ease of selection and use in the catalog, and then you need to showcase how these goals are directly integrated into the scope definition process. And the way you can most simplistically do this is by creating that pick list, adding the column, and mapping it. And we recommend that you do that mapping at least the L2 level. However, you might map certain business goals and objectives at a lower level. It's important to note that you'll have supporting processes that are mandatory or required in order to support the larger business process or goal or objective. And so it's okay to create additional goals about how the supporting processes will support the overall goals and objectives. And it's important to reinforce with your stakeholders and the project as a whole the idea that every in-scope business process serves as a strategic business purpose. And here again, we're going to talk a little bit about the collaborative goal and process mapping process. I cannot stress enough that this needs to be a collaborative effort to map the goals to the business processes. You'll need to involve key stakeholders to ensure a comprehensive and accurate mapping. When we involve key stakeholders from the different lines of business, parts of your organization, departments, divisions, regions, etc., however your organization is organized, then we have the business stakeholders who understand your business processes, and this process fosters a shared vision and commitment to those project goals because they understand the goals and objectives and they're helping to deliver those. And they also understand how the processes impact the ability to meet those goals and objectives. So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about how we define the project scope. We've broken the process of defining your project scope down into 5 basic steps. Step 1 is defining those business goals, which is what we just talked about. And again, we recommend that you add that as a column and preferably create like a pick list that you can map to at least the level 2 of the catalog. Next, you'll need to provide access to the business process catalog to all of the relevant stakeholders that are involved in the project, including business users, project managers, and your technical teams. It's important that you put this catalog somewhere where it can be collaborated on with everyone, and that you set a framework for how people will update and make changes to this. And so making sure that the permissions and security is set correctly on it, whether it's just an Excel file that is on a shared drive, or if you put this directly into SharePoint, or perhaps you can upload the catalog directly into Azure DevOps and use Azure DevOps as a way to manage, or a business process modeling tool. It's important that you encourage stakeholders to thoroughly review the catalog, and they're checking for completeness, accuracy, and relevance of all of the different listed business processes. At the most simplistic level, they're just reviewing the rows that exist, removing any rows that don't apply, updating rows, changing terminology where it might make sense for your business, and adding anything that might be specific to your particular organization, project, or industry, for example. The next step in the process is to prioritize. The prioritization process is important for several reasons. Here, we want to identify critical business processes that are essential for the success of the project. So this is not only where we're going to identify what is our minimum viable product or MVP for a particular phase of your project, but it's also where we can identify things that are nice to have. You'll also want to use the prioritization process as an opportunity to think about how we take the processes and split them up into the phases that we're going to implement. If you're doing a large, big bang project, so to speak, then we still need to chunk the work down into smaller, more feasible pieces of work that can be achieved by the people that are going to be assigned to them from a project management standpoint. But if your project is going to be split up into multiple phases, whether that's rollouts to different countries or regions or departments, or if we're focusing more on one line of business versus another line of business, we need to prioritize those processes. And some processes might be more critical in one line of business than they are in a different line of business. And the last step is the alignment and adjustment. It's important that the project scope aligns with the catalog entries. And you're going to want to go through a process where you cross-reference the prioritized processes with your project objectives and requirements. And if we went through the process of aligning to those business goals and objectives, this process should be pretty easy. Obviously, requirements will get more detailed as the project goes on, and you'll need to keep coming back to this and reiterating on the process as the project progresses. But it's important to make sure that you don't forget to identify any areas where customizations or specific configurations within Dynamics 365 are going to be necessary to support those listed processes. So again, in the most simple form, you can simply just add a few columns to the spreadsheet and track a status or comments from your users to keep track of that information. And you can simply delete things that don't make sense or add new rows where applicable for your particular business. So the process of analyzing your current business processes is a process that we generally call discovery. This is a very simplistic, high-level view of how to perform that process. We'll be doing more tech talks in the future that deep dive into the discovery process in more detail. But it's important to understand and document your current processes. And we're not talking about the software step-by-steps that you do in your current technology or your current system. It's the actual process that your data flows through. What data must be gathered? What are the outputs of your data? Who are the stakeholders that are involved in the different steps? And the catalog can aid and help you in this process of identifying the different strengths, weaknesses, and areas for improvement. But the best way to do that is by talking with the business stakeholders that belong to each of these different business processes. This whole process of discovery and analyzing the current business process helps facilitate the alignment of the project scope with those existing workflows or business process flows within your organization. But I do want to call out that there are some pitfalls to avoid when you're in that scope definition, discovery phase of your project. It's important to remember that we need to have forward thinking and avoid the trap of designing business processes that are solely based on the existing technology or the existing step-by-step processes that are used today. One thing to make sure that we don't do is replicating the current process without considering the needs for the future. So for example, we don't want to simply transfer existing workflows without optimizing for the capabilities of Dynamics 365 or the new technology that you'll be implementing. Next is the danger of redesigning for the new system. There is a risk of merely adding processes in the new system without reevaluating and optimizing your existing business processes. And by just transferring manual processes to automated ones without considering any efficiency gains is something that we want you to avoid. There can also be an impact on the long-term success of your project when we don't have a good scope definition process in place. It can lead to missed opportunities for process improvement. And an example of this is focusing just on system familiarity over leveraging Dynamics 365 or technology for enhanced efficiency. And lastly, we have focusing on business goals, not the current constraints. It's important to make sure the need to align your business processes with the overarching business goals rather than with the limitations of your current system. So for example, prioritizing business objectives over familiarity with existing processes. Again, that's something that we would want to try to avoid. The next step in your process of defining that business scope is really about recognizing dependencies and interaction. It's important to identify any dependencies that exist between processes. In the guidance documentation that we're publishing out on the Learn site, which we talked about in part 1 and part 2 of our series, you can leverage this as a tool to help you in this process. And we've also done some work in the initial template that we've provided to create links in the Azure DevOps template between processes that have interconnectivity. But every business is unique, so you need to think about what is unique about your business and how the different processes interact. It's important that you highlight those interactions that may impact the overall project scope. And in this process of identifying dependencies, it's not just dependencies within Dynamics 365. It's important to think about dependencies that are going on outside of your business. So if you have other projects that are happening that Dynamics 365 project is going to be dependent on, you need to identify that. This is also like that first clue or cue that maybe we need integrations between other systems. So in that initial scoping process, those dependencies are important, and they're going to provide that comprehensive understanding of your overall Dynamics 365 ecosystem, and it helps you start to craft that initial diagram of Dynamics 365 with all of the other components in your technology landscape and ecosystem. Again, I cannot stress enough the collaborative nature of defining scope with the business stakeholders of each of the different areas. It's important that you assign those stakeholders and keep it in mind again that you might have multiple, especially if your organization has multiple lines of business, multiple countries or regions that you operate in. So defining that scope and making sure that the stakeholders are in alignment with how your organization is structured, I cannot emphasize it enough. You're going to want to make sure that you're encouraging involvement from those key business units to ensure that you have a holistic approach, and use the business process catalog that we have provided as a tool to help foster that collaboration. By making those assignments, adding columns that match your business structure is key to a successful collaborative scope definition. Now, of course, documenting your business scope is important, whether you use our catalog or not. You're going to want to make sure that you have thorough documentation about the business processes that you're documenting and discovering in that discovery phase. That thorough documentation can look like a lot of different things. It could be standard operating procedures. It could be summaries. We're going to be hosting another Tech Talk in the future that dives into more detail about discovery, and we'll dive into more tools and techniques for that process later. But you can use the business process catalog as a framework for creating a detailed scope document because it has all these lines and rows in it. And by adding the unique patterns and user stories or use cases from your business, it's going to give you a very detailed, clear scope for your project. And that scope is going to help provide clarity and a reference point that you can use throughout the implementation. That catalog can then become the reference point and the work breakdown structure and the work back schedule of the work that needs to be done to achieve those goals and objectives that we set out for at the beginning. So let's talk a little bit more about how to estimate your project scope. We recommend that you start off the process of estimating your project with very high level set of steps. First is defining the workshops. We'll talk a little bit more about this on our next slide, but here we recommend that you start with a minimum of workshops that are at the L2 level for your project. Then you're going to create a work breakdown structure. The work breakdown structure is that detailed list of the business processes and the process steps or configurations that are going to be included. Then you're going to need to identify any of those integrations. looking through all of the patterns and finding patterns that need to integrate to another system. And you're also going to need to identify any of your data migrations. Data migrations where I'm bringing data in from a legacy system and I need to bring it over to Dynamics 365 in order for the project to be successful. You're also going to think about identifying gaps. Gaps could be any row that you had to add or modify in the spreadsheet because, if we had to add or modify or change it, it likely means that we have a gap right off the top. You're going to find gaps later on in your project too as you get more detailed requirements and go further on in your project. That's why it's an iterative process, especially with a large technology implementation. But it's important that you t-shirt size, and we've got a slide a little bit later on where I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to t-shirt size, like small, medium, large, the work that needs to be done. And then once you've sized it, then you can start to estimate the amount of time per task in that detailed work breakdown structure that needs to happen. And then you can start to map those resources and then estimate the cost per resource. Obviously, the resources that you use, whether they're internal or external, like come from a customer, come from a partner, come from an ISV or third party, there might be lots of different resources that have to be involved throughout the project. And so knowing which resources need to perform which tasks will help you get an accurate estimate when you're putting that project estimate together. And then it's important to remember to add time for standard tasks. This includes things like performance testing, UAT, the actual installation and deployment, fixing bugs that are found, and that fudge factor, if you will, like the unknown information, training, documentation, and overall project management are all important things to remember to include in the estimate. So let's talk a little bit more about how to define workshops. We recommend that you clearly define the purpose of your workshops when you're doing the estimation process. And by working with the stakeholders, they're going to be able to help tell you exactly how many workshops you're going to need based on the structure of the organization and the complexity of those business processes. So for example, we recommend that you use the L2s or business process areas in the catalog as a starting baseline. We haven't included any workshops as their own roles or work item types in the template, but we are planning to do this in the future. But basically, if we take like order to cash as an example, and let's say we're talking about the area for creating and managing sales, let's say your organization has 3 channels of sales. We have business to business, we have an online channel, and we have some brick and mortar retail stores. Because those 3 are so very unique and so very different, you might choose, instead of having 1 workshop for creating and managing sales, that you need to have 3 workshops for creating and managing sales. That's just one simple example of how you might expand that out to make sense for your business or your organization. Next, in that process, you're going to want to make sure that you're identifying who exactly is going to be involved. So those stakeholders. And remember that your workshops are iterative. So the workshops that you do at the beginning of your project are going to be more general and high level and giving you a big picture. And then obviously as the project progresses, your design workshops are going to be more detailed. So those initial workshops are like discovery workshops and might have one structure, whereas later in your project, the design workshops and testing workshops are going to have more detail. So that's the kind of process that we recommend at a high level. We'll have more tech talks in the future to talk about that. But if you want to include workshops, you can add a custom work item type into your Azure DevOps and insert rows into your spreadsheet to represent those workshops. The next step in the process is creating that work breakdown structure. A work breakdown structure is simply just a detailed breakdown of all the different project tasks that need to be done. The administer to operate section of our catalog includes a lot of those standard like installation things that need to happen no matter what. But then all of the other end-to-end business processes are going to be specific to your organization. And so the scope of your project or size of your project is going to vary in the individual tasks that need to happen to make order to cash, and the processes that are in scope are going to be different if you're doing procure to pay, for example. So the work breakdown structure, we recommend that you kind of use the business processes, the L3s and the L4s, and the steps and configurations that are required for those. We don't currently include any configuration work items in the template, but we are planning on our roadmap to add configurations, and we'll do more tech talks in the future to talk more specifically about how to use those once they become available. But when I demonstrate a little bit later on, I'll show you how you can manually add configurations in just one example. And I also want to point out that you can reference the Learn articles for the L3s to get those details about the configuration steps that are required for a specific business process or pattern of a business process. So the next area that I want to dive into a little bit more detail is the process for identifying integrations. It's important to note that the catalog doesn't include any integrations in the base catalog. So you're always going to have to add your integrations in. We recommend that you just insert a new row, and each interface is a new row. So that includes inbound and outbound. Should be two separate rows, for example. And it's important that any integrations you add should relate back to the business process that they're a part of. And so when we think about the example of like an integration for a PLM, a product lifecycle management tool, let's say we're going to import projects into Dynamics 365 from the PLM, and we're going to enrich them in Dynamics 365, and we need to export that data back out and send it to a downstream distribution system. You would want to make sure that you have at least two rows to indicate that inbound flow from your PLM and the outbound flow to your distribution system, just as one example. Next are data migrations. So data migrations are not included in the base catalog either. So it's important to remember that you'll want to include and identify all those data migrations that are going to be needed at the onset of your project. This is an important process because, and we recommend that you insert one new row for each data migration that needs to be included in your business and in your project. And they might align to different phases, but it's important to note that we recommend each source system is a new row. So let's say, for example, we're migrating customers. This would relate to the create a customer business process. So you'd find that process in the catalog. And if we're going to import customers from 3 different source systems that are used in 3 countries and regions, I would want 3 rows to indicate each of those source systems that I'm going to migrate customers from. Keeping in mind that if there's going to be additional deduping or other things like that that you identify in that discovery phase for your customer data, you'll want to make sure that you create tasks for those as well, because those processes can be more time consuming than the actual process of migrating data itself. So make sure that you're thinking about that when you're thinking about your data migrations. Once you've identified those, then you're going to go through that process of identifying your gaps and t-shirt sizing. Gaps are anything that don't fit into Dynamics 365 out of the box. Any ISV that you're including in your implementation is a gap. So we need to make sure that we're including what are those business processes and patterns that will be included. If you're going to be doing large development projects to add functionality specific to your business or your, industry, for example, those would be gaps as well. And this should be, the big ticket items should be identified as part of the discovery process. But it's important to note that more gaps are going to come later. Hopefully they're smaller gaps. So you need to make sure that you have a change management process in place to help with this overall process. And then you're going to want to go through a process of sizing all gaps, integrations, and data migrations. Basically, any row that you had to insert or modify in the catalog is a gap because it wasn't there out of the box. And when you do this process, you're going to want to define your sizing criteria. You can keep it very simple, like small, medium, large, and small equals 4 hours, medium equals 8 hours, and large equals 12 hours. But depending on the complexity and the size of your project, you'll need to decide what the right sizing criteria is and estimate for those sizes. So you might, by and large, do small, medium, large, but then have two really, really big ticket items that you estimate the effort for those individually outside of your standard kind of small, medium, large approach. And then those other considerations that I talked about, you're going to want to think about all of those unknown factors. When you're estimating your project, it's important to build in time for those unknown factors. Each round of workshops and discovery and design that you do is going to bring new business requirements and potential gaps. And so you need to build some time in to account for that and have a good change management process in place. You're also going to need to make sure that you're including time for testing and iterating on that testing. When you test, you're going to have bugs, issues, training, remediations, etc. And so you're going to need to be able to reiterate on those. So don't just include 2 weeks for UAT. Make sure you include 2 weeks for UAT plus, say, 1 week for remediation, any issues you found. And then you need another week for retesting anything that needed to be tweaked or adjusted based on those remediation. You'll also want to make sure that you include time for your documentation and training. These are oftentimes things that are forgotten in that initial estimation process. And there's a lot of time and effort that goes into documenting and training your users. Creating training materials can be a very timely time-consuming process, and don't underestimate the effort that's required there. And I strongly recommend that you do this process whether the stakeholders that are responsible for it are going to be internal or external, like to the customer organization. So if the partner is going to be responsible for certain parts and the customer is going to be responsible for certain parts, make sure you're identifying that in your scope and estimation process. And I still recommend anything that's going to be done by the customer should be estimated, because if you only have 4 resources that are dedicated to the project full time and you have 10,000 hours worth of work, even if you have an army of consultants on the partner side helping you, you're never going to reach the finish line, because the constraint there is the 4 resources that are dedicated to the project. Make sure as well that you're building in time to your project plan for monitoring and optimizing. Monitoring includes like the project management aspects and so on of your project, and time to optimize and update your project plan and, all the different work that's happening as well. And the last one that, I want to make sure everyone includes in their estimate is time for continuous improvement, your change management processes. Make sure that you're implementing that culture of continuous improvement and regularly revisiting and refining your processes. And these things take time. So whether this is your initial deployment or it's phase 4, where we're just adding on the fixed assets module to your finance deployment, all of these principles still remain as a foundation to use for that process. All right, so now the moment you've all been waiting for. We're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about how to import the business process catalog and your refined scope into Azure DevOps. Before I do the demonstration, I have a few slides to help introduce this and give you a high-level overview of the recommended mapping. So our template, what we have mapped is end-to-end business processes equal area paths. We have not created any workshops in the default template, like with a workshop item type, but you could very easily copy and paste all the business process area rows to do that if you want a custom work item type in your implementation. But what we have mapped is that the areas equal epics, those are the L2s, business processes, which are the L3s, are features, and patterns and scenarios, which are the L4s, map to user stories. A couple of things to note about the template that we have provided out on the Download Center, which is available at aka.ms/business process catalog. And we talked through that in part 2, and I'll show it very briefly again today, but the current template that is available only supports the agile methodology in Azure DevOps. It's also important to note that there's a limitation in Azure DevOps that you can only import 1,000 rows at a time. It's also important to note that before you can import it, you have to create the area paths. There's also some custom fields that are included in the template that if you want those custom fields, you have to create them inside of your project first. And after you've created your area paths, you'll need to update the area paths in the spreadsheet. The area path part of it includes the name of your project. And since everybody's project will be named differently, you'll need to do a find and replace on that. The detailed steps for that process and how to create area paths in Azure DevOps can be found on the link at the bottom of this slide. And it's important that if you're going to import, like if you've got more than 1,000 rows, that you don't import portions of an end-to-end. You should include the entire end-to-end in one single import. So like, don't just go to row 1,000 and do a file save as and delete all the other rows. You need to end at an end-to-end process so that the associations and the links get created properly between the different levels of the hierarchy. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my browser now. And we are going to take a quick look at the process for downloading. So I'm here in my browser, and I've already opened up the download center. The link to get here is aka.ms/business process catalog. And when you get here, you'll use that big blue download button right in the middle to download the spreadsheet. There are two different versions of the file available. One is the XLSX file, which is like pretty easier to navigate, more user-friendly. And the other version is a CSV version that's titled ADO Upload. So that's the version that you're going to want to use to import into Azure DevOps. Once you've downloaded the file, you're going to go over to the Azure DevOps project. But I want to quickly point out, this is the link to the article on how to import the business process catalog. We have included a bunch of information here about the prerequisites that you need to do inside of your project and inside of the spreadsheet. There's a number of blank files or blank columns in the spreadsheet. So I'm going to quickly open the spreadsheet, which I have already downloaded, to just show it to you so you can be familiar with it. But you'll notice the ID column is blank and we have 3 title columns. It's important that you keep these 3 title columns and you keep the list sorted exactly how it is. And this is what creates the links or the relationships between the parent and child work items. There are a number of columns that don't have any data in them, and you can add data to them, like the assigned to, the business owner, and the business process lead. Obviously, these will be like the named users in your organization. We will be enhancing the catalog in future releases to add more columns, and we'll do more tech talks with new releases to kind of explain how to use those columns. But it's important to note that area path column, the first part, everything behind that backslash will need to be replaced with the name of your project. If you don't create the area paths named exactly as the end-to-end processes and you do something different, you'll need to update all of your area paths across the entire project. And so then there's a handful of additional columns, like some of these columns are custom columns. So you'd actually need to create a business value, time criticality, and business outcome category in your Azure DevOps before you can import them. If you don't want to create those columns, you can delete them from the spreadsheet before you import it. We've also given everything a priority of 1. And you'll obviously, in your discovery process, want to assign appropriate levels to it. But the Learn article out here that we've pasted the link to has the details on how to do this and what custom fields are needed, as well as links on how to add custom fields to your project. And once you're ready and you have your project, you're going to go into those project settings and navigate into project configuration. And this is where, and you'll click the areas tab. This is where you'll create those areas. And so you'll have to pre-create these before you can import. We have not created any iterations in our template or included the iteration column, but that is a step that we recommend you do, especially if you have a multi-phase project. Obviously, you could just delete all the rows that don't apply, but if you're planning to do things in a later phase, you can assign them to different iterations. You can even make a generic iteration called out of scope, for example, for things that you aren't planning. So even if you don't know if you're going to do it later, it's just in an iteration called out of scope, and you can always move it back in rather than deleting it. So that's just a tip there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the breadcrumb bar and go back to my project and click on boards. And from the board screen, that's where you can see all of your work items. And this is where you'll find the import work items button. This will open up a new side pane dialog, and this is where you're going to click on the choose file and go browse to the file that you want to import and click open. Mine is going to fail because the file has more than 1,000 rows. So you'll see I get an error message because the maximum number of work items allowed on import is 1,000. So I'd need to go slim that down. I've already imported them, and it takes a few minutes to do. But once you've imported the file, you'll actually see all of the data that you've imported will appear on the grid on the left-hand side. You can edit any of those items if you need to before you click the Save Items button in the upper left-hand corner. The Save Items is important. That takes several minutes once you click that Save Items for it to actually save, especially, obviously it depends on how many rows you're importing, but if you're doing a full 1,000 rows, or close to it, it will take a little bit of time to save those. And then once they're saved, then your work items will show up, and we've created those relationships. So I'm going to go to queries, and I've created a query to filter down just to the order to cash area, just to show you a little bit more in detail kind of what this looks like and how it works. So in my example, at the top here, we have the monitor customer credit and collections. That's my epic, which is an L2. And below that, we have broken it down into a handful of features that make up the monitor customer credit and collections. And then below that are the user stories, which are the specific L4s or patterns. Every single one of the work items that we've created it has links in it. So like if I highlight at the top level for monitor customer credit and collections, you'll notice it has 12 links. So it relates, it has all these child links. And if I click on like more detailed ones, I can see the details, but I'm going to scroll down and find set customer credit limits. So set customer credit limits is an example of an article that you can see here, we've got a bunch of children and one parent. So it's linked to that parent work item. And I have manually added a handful of configuration items here. These are the configuration items that are in the LERD article for setting customer credit limits. So I manually created these configuration items. So in this example, it's define cash discount codes. We've mapped and kind of indicated which product this is configured in. It's part of accounts receivable. And we've put a lot of custom fields in here. We will be delivering configuration items in a future release of our business process catalog, but you can manually add these and relate them to the business processes that they go with. Only one can be the parent. So in this case, I set the parent to be the set customer credit limits, but you'll notice that this also relates to some test cases for applying cash discounts to payments and establishing cash discounting policies. In future releases, we'll also be adding more test cases and user stories and things like that in here. So keep an eye out for future releases with additional functionality. So with that kind of wraps up what we wanted to demonstrate and show for you today. We have compiled a list of resources that you can use to help you get started with the business process catalog, making requests, reporting errors, things like that. You can use this business process catalog requests. We do invite you to stay connected with us. If you're not already, you can follow Fast Track on our LinkedIn page, Find us on the community YouTube channel or subscribe to upcoming Tech Talks. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. And so we did have a couple that came through. As someone said, I have a question about the Azure DevOps import file for the catalog. If we import and look at the backlog, we will see all processes across areas as epics on the same level and cannot easily differentiate between sales and manufacturing because they are all on the same level. So we cannot use the backlog view to see different areas separately. Would you provide a dashboard or list of queries based on the new catalog to have better tracking of progress per area instead, or do you have some recommendations about that? I'm used to working with the backlog and hierarchy per area end-to-end process and not all processes in a flat list on the backlog. It looks like Ajit answered this question. And so, so what Ajit said is like you could create a higher level epic, which is say the next release and nested epics for your L2s, or use the tags to then provide a means for ADO queries to separate the parallel process areas. And I agree. I do like the idea of some sample queries or dashboards, and we will put that into our backlog of ideas. I think we have intentions of doing all of these things. We've just been prioritizing trying to get the configuration work items and test cases all in the catalog as our next step of priorities, but that's great feedback. Ajit, did you have anything that you wanted to add on that one?
No, I think if I understood that correctly, that would be our answer. I think the next question, Rachel, on the project governance work items. By the way, these are really, really good questions, right? Because I suspect the questions you're asking, almost every project would be asking themselves these very, very same questions. And on the project governance work items, the answer is slightly more complicated, right? Because a lot of the project governance type topics may span across multiple business areas and may apply to the project or the implementation as a whole. And in those cases, it's hard to kind of map it to a process. Where you do have kind of governance topics that you could directly relate to a business process, then you can certainly use the catalog, and you can either create a new column or you could use one of the existing columns and use that to actually map your actions or requirements or decisions against that process.
And another tip on that one too, Ajit, is we do have an end-to-end business process that's called administer to operate. Yep. And that administer to operate is where a lot of those like overall deployment, environment, governance things live at. Yeah. So I would encourage you to check the administer to operate section to see if there's a place in there for you to put those overall project governance. We had another one that just came in that, was asking, do you recommend exporting work items as a document and use it as a solution design document? That's a great question. Do you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so one of the things I would say is that, yes, you could certainly do that, right? Because one of the things that can become very difficult especially in larger projects, is keeping track of the documentation versions, etc. And typically, if you have a good solid model of your business processes, you've got them in DevOps, you can use that to then say, I have a unique tag for each process all the way down to the level at which I want to manage my project. I've got the associated document, either requirement or design or test case or whatever. So you can absolutely use that catalog in that way.
Awesome. So we had a couple more come in. So someone asked, do you plan to release queries and dashboards on ADO specific to the business process catalog? I think that's something that we will look to do in the future. That's probably a little bit more of a long-term roadmap item, but it's great feedback. And if there's specific things that you want to see, please give us the feedback by going to aka.ms/business process catalog requests. We also had somebody ask, how frequently will you publish the business process catalog? Will it be on a monthly basis? Right now, it's been more on the quarterly basis. But like as we get more like configurations, we might publish more frequently than quarterly, but quarterly is kind of like our bare minimum, but we might do some that are more monthly as we do some mapping and get like larger sections with their configurations. Somebody asked, do you plan to make available the new work item types in ADO? and was asking how. I will find a link. And I actually think that the article that I published might have the instructions on how to do it. It is a custom work item type. So is the workshop. So we have a couple of custom work item types that we use internally to help manage projects. And so, and we might even do a whole separate tech talk on that. I don't know, Ajit, that might make sense for us to kind of put a session together specifically on work item types.
Yeah.
Because I think there could be a lot of confusion on like what to use for the different work item types. So it's a feature of Azure DevOps that you can create custom work item types. So we'll look at like finding that documentation and probably doing a follow-up tech talk on that. And then the last question that I see in here is, do you plan to have config files, like DMF-ready Excel files, in the configuration work items? It's a great suggestion. I don't know that we're going to put those directly in our work items, but we do have some work that has already started in the Guidance Hub. It's a handful of entities right now, and it's like some of the biggest, most commonly used entities that are giving you the guidance on like which entity to use for what situation. So like importing customers, importing journals, etc. So we are expanding that documentation. And all of that documentation is available in the implementation tools section on the Guidance Hub. And we actually talked about that in part 1 of our Tech Talk series. So I do encourage you to go check that out if you haven't seen part 1 already. All right, that looks like all the questions that we have for today. Obviously, if you have more questions, we do encourage you to put those out. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to complete a short survey about today's session. You can use the link. We'll put it in the chat as well for you, or you can scan the QR code that you see here on your screen to take that short survey. And I think that's all that we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Philip, I'll hand it back over to you to wrap us up.
Cool. Thanks, Rachel. And to you, our audience, for attending our Tech Talk today. We hope you have a great rest of your day ahead.